Good day, all. This talk will look at how feminism works by examining 4 key issues in feminist theory. Those issues concern the impact of 4 aspects of society on gender relations and gender inequality. Those 4 aspects are biology, economics, culture, and politics. Each of these aspects has been the main focus of one of the so-called Big 3 schools of feminism. Radical feminism focuses on biology, Marxist feminism focuses on the economy, liberal feminism focuses on culture, and all of them focus on politics. I would argue that to understand gender relations and gender inequality, we have to look at all 4 of these. So firstly, biology. The role of biology in promoting gender inequality was first examined by feminists when Simone de Beauvoir published The Second Sex in 1949. In this book, she tried to establish the origins of gender inequality. She argued that in early tribal societies, life was hard and dangerous. This meant that men's greater biological strength made men more important to the survival of the tribe, and so made men the tribe's natural leaders. Tribal societies did not have inequalities of wealth or power, but they did have inequality of status or prestige, and this was largely based on their gender division of labor. Men's work was primarily hunting and defense or warfare. Both of these involve an element of physical danger, and so both of them require not just strength, but also courage or strength of character. Each man was risking his life for the tribe. De Beauvoir argued that this raised men's social status. On the other hand, women's biology meant that women's main role was in childbirth, child suckling, and child care, as well as gathering vegetables and cooking. De Beauvoir argued that since getting pregnant is just part of the cycle of life, it wasn't seen as an accomplishment in the same way that killing a buffalo was a manly feat, and so it did not raise women's status. She argued that the very first type of social inequality, much older than class inequality, was men attaining higher status over women. Now, status is subjective. It exists only in people's minds. But de Beauvoir argued that this subjective inequality was primarily based on the objective biological difference between the sexes. She said, quote, "From humanity's beginnings, their biological advantage has enabled the males to affirm their status as society's sole and sovereign subjects." In other words, biology has put men in charge of society. De Beauvoir did also recognize that both economic and cultural factors play a role in creating gender inequality. She noted that women were discriminated against in the workforce by being forced to accept wages that were much lower than men's, that Western society had given women domestic responsibilities which limited their economic opportunities, and also that modern culture socialized girls to want to become housewives and not to upset their husbands by being too independent. However, she argued that the original cause for the rise of gender inequality was biology. More recent theorists have disagreed with de Beauvoir's historical analysis for several reasons. Firstly, anthropologists have challenged de Beauvoir's argument that getting pregnant did not give women status. Sure, sometimes it's easy. You have sex, you get pregnant. But it's not always that simple. These days we have fertility clinics that help many couples who have difficulty getting pregnant. In tribal societies, they didn't have fertility clinics, but they did have fertility symbols. All over the world, anthropologists have found statues and pictures of heavily pregnant women and giant male phalluses, designed to enlist the help of the spirit world in getting pregnant. This shows that getting pregnant is not always that easy. Sometimes you even have to ask the spirits for help. So, getting pregnant can be an accomplishment. Secondly, the spirits that were prayed to in these matters were generally female. There were both male and female spirits, but since women give birth, it was assumed that female spirits were in charge of reproduction. Indeed, in the tribal spiritual hierarchy, the supreme spirit was usually female. Some version of Mother Earth or Mother Nature, or the goddess or Gaia, as she's been variously called. Since women create life, early societies generally believed that a goddess, not a god, was the creator who had created the world and so given birth to all life. The high status accorded to female spirits was a reflection of the high status that women had in tribal society. And thirdly, back then, they had no hospitals or medical equipment, so women quite often died in childbirth. So yes, men risked their lives when they went to war, but women risked their lives every time they got pregnant. Each gender had its own dangers to face in the fulfillment of its social role. In short, women's status was not as low as de Beauvoir thought. This has been confirmed by the study of modern tribal societies, such as the indigenous peoples of North America, whose culture invariably emphasizes respect for women. The origins of gender inequality are to be found in agricultural society rather than tribal society, as de Beauvoir believed. Despite these criticisms, de Beauvoir's work was taken up in the 70s by radical feminists such as Shulamith Firestone. She was born in Ottawa, but her family moved to the US when she was a child, so she is known as an American writer. Firestone agreed with de Beauvoir that gender inequality was actually much older and more basic than class inequality, and that the principal reason for this was biology. In a sense, she said, women's biology betrays women because it forces them to spend much of their adult lives pregnant or breastfeeding. This was particularly the case in early tribal societies, since they had no birth control. And while pregnant or nursing small, helpless children, women were unable to look after themselves. Men had to provide them with food and protect them from danger. This put women into a position of dependency on men, which they've largely remained in to this day. Meanwhile, men's biology empowers men, because it makes men, on average, bigger and stronger than women. The positive side of this is that it makes men protectors of women. But the negative side is that it has enabled the widespread use of male violence towards women. Firestone argued that if economic dependency was not enough to keep women in line, then men have literally beaten women into submission. Firestone and other radical feminists have argued that there are two kinds of male violence towards women: institutionalized violence and individualized violence. Pre-industrial societies had institutionalized violence, meaning they had customs that promoted violence towards women. These can be found all over the world. I shall just give you a few examples. In India, they have the custom of widow burning. This is where a widow is tied up and thrown onto her dead husband's funeral pyre to be burned to death so that she can serve him in heaven as she served him on earth. These days this is illegal, but it still happens. In China, they had the custom of foot binding, where young girls' feet were bound so tightly that it was painful for them even to walk, let alone fight for their rights. In Europe, the witch hunts of the Inquisition tortured and burnt at the stake huge numbers of women. No one knows exactly how many, but some estimates claim that over 1 million women were killed in this way over a period of about 200 years. Sub-Saharan Africa to this day has the custom of genital mutilation, where women's genitals are essentially cut out and sewn back up. The United Nations is fighting to eradicate this custom, but it is still being done to millions of young women. And finally, all over the world, there is the custom of female infanticide. Boys were more highly valued than girls, so sometimes when a baby turned out to be a girl, she was just thrown in the river or abandoned in the woods. Modern Western society has, of course, banned such customs. However, say radical feminists, this is not because our society cares so much about women. It's just because industrial society destroys all pre-industrial customs, good and bad. Industrial society emphasizes individualism over custom. So, institutionalized violence towards women has just been replaced by individualized violence. This comes in many forms, such as rape, beatings, femicide, sexual harassment in the workplace, persecution of lesbians, and enforced prostitution. But in today's Western society, male violence towards women occurs primarily within the family, in the form of domestic abuse. Domestic abuse normally has 3 interconnected parts: physical abuse, or beatings, sexual abuse, or rape, and psychological or verbal abuse, which primarily consists of belittling the woman by telling her that she's stupid and useless and clumsy and deserves to be beaten up. Abusers justify their abuse in this way, and if they can create a negative self-image in their women, then they can get those women to believe they deserve it and to accept the abuse. Moreover, even though only a minority of women may actually experience male violence, all women are made aware of it. Society creates an atmosphere of fear of male violence, which is designed to intimidate all women, argued Firestone. Firestone argued that the family, even more than the workplace, is the primary social institution upholding male domination in modern society. So, she came to the conclusion that the family should be abolished. that men and women should live separately, that women should all become lesbians, and that all reproduction should be in vitro through test tube babies. This view was too radical even for most radical feminists, and Firestone eventually became somewhat isolated. Her other ideas were also criticized, not least by other feminists. First of all, if you say that biology causes gender inequality, then you're arguing that biology is destiny. Well, human biology is not going to change. Women are going to go on having the babies. Men are going to go on being bigger and stronger. So, if biology causes gender inequality, then you're never going to eliminate it. And that is not a position that many feminists are willing to accept. Secondly, biology does not inevitably make women economically dependent on men. It depends on social circumstances. Early industrial society created a nuclear family of one man and one woman, and then took women's jobs away, leaving them dependent on their men. But pre-industrial societies had much larger families. In the tribe, pregnant women were not looked after by the men, they were looked after by the other women. Yes, women needed men to hunt for them and defend them. But men needed women to bear and raise the children. The children were the tribe's future. Without children, there is no tribe. So, men needed women just as much as women needed men. This was a situation of mutual dependency, not just one of women being dependent on men. Third and finally, the critics also argue that radical feminism has misunderstood the nature and purpose of male violence in both pre-industrial and industrial societies. First of all, in agricultural societies, history shows that the population always keeps growing until it outgrows the food supply, leading to mass malnutrition and then plague. It's happened over and over, the world over, for thousands of years. The only way to prevent this is to limit population growth. But back then, they had no effective birth control. What they did have was violence. And to be effective, it had to be violence towards women, because women bear the babies. If you kill a man, you've only killed one person. But if you kill a woman, you have in effect killed all the children she would have had if she'd lived. In this strategy, the younger the better, which is why female infanticide is a common custom in pre-industrial societies. But the purpose of such customs is not to establish male domination or patriarchy, as radical feminists claimed. Rather, they are a brutal but effective means of population control. Before the invention of contraceptives, women had to pay the price for the survival of society. Now, to be clear, this was not understood at the time. As radical feminists have pointed out, the direct motivation for customs like female infanticide is the culturally established higher male status and the preference that parents therefore have for boys over girls. However, this is what anthropologists term the emic viewpoint, the cultural or subjective viewpoint of the people involved. While this is valid in its own terms, it must be supplemented by the ethic viewpoint, the scientific or objective viewpoint of the outside observer. Couples who abandon their baby girls in the woods don't think of themselves as saving society from overpopulation and plague, because they see their actions only from the micro or individual viewpoint. But the social scientist who looks at this phenomenon on the macro scale can see the objective consequences of their actions for society as a whole. The higher status that their culture grants to males is therefore not an end in itself, but is rather just a means to accomplish some degree of population control. Fortunately, modern birth control technology has made such customs redundant. However, women have had to fight for access to this technology. As condoms, diaphragms, abortions, and other forms of birth control became increasingly available in the 19th century, male voices, partly based on religious principles, declared them to be immoral. And in the late 19th century, male politicians made them illegal. Only in the 1920s, after about half a century of active struggle by the women's movement, was contraception re-legalized and birth control clinics were opened. Abortion was not re-legalized until the 60s and 70s. And the 2022 overturning of Roe v. Wade in the US has put American women's abortion rights in jeopardy once more. Feminists argue that male lawmakers have no right to tell women what to do with their own bodies. But the lawmakers disagree. What is clear is that the biological differences between the sexes underlie an ongoing struggle over control of reproduction and women's reproductive rights. In modern industrial society, male violence is also not the result of a deliberate, cold-blooded decision by men to beat women into submission. Rather, domestic violence must be understood as part of an intergenerational cycle of violence. Most abusers were themselves abused as children. They were socialized to accept violence as a normal part of domestic life. The anger that underlies their violence is really anger at their abuser. But since that abuser is often out of reach, either far away or even dead, they vent their frustration on the weaker members of their own household, not just their wives, but also their children and any elderly relatives living with them. They also frequently get into drunken barroom brawls with other men. Their wives are often their most convenient targets, but they're not just violent towards their wives. They're violent towards everybody. Violence has become a way of life for them. It is beyond their control. This violence is emotional, not calculated. It's based on rage, not on a cold-blooded decision to establish male dominance. While estimates vary, it is widely accepted that in Canada, about 10% of women living with a man face domestic violence. While this number is still too high, it does tell us that only a minority of men are violent towards women. And for the most part, this is a minority with psychological problems. The violence stems from the abuser's own emotional pain from their childhood abuse. And the solution for it is therapy, such as that provided by anger management courses. However, while they may have misunderstood the motivation of domestic violence, radical feminists were quite right to draw attention to the problem. In the 70s and 80s, radical feminists forced Western governments to confront the issue of domestic violence for the first time, to toughen up laws against it, and to establish shelters and other resources for battered wives. To conclude on biology, it is obvious that the difference between men and women begins with biology. However, biology is not destiny. The biological differences between the sexes do not necessarily lead to gender inequality, female dependency, or male violence. They can lead to all of those things, but whether they actually do so depends on social circumstances which change over time. Biology provides the starting point for gender roles and gender relations. But after that, social factors need to be looked at, such as the economy. The economy is the main focus of Marxist feminism, and Marxist feminism begins, of course, with the work of Karl Marx. Marx linked gender inequality to class inequality. He argued that both women and the male working class were being dominated and exploited by the male ruling class, just in different ways. He declared that he supported the emancipation of women, just as he supported the emancipation of the working class. He believed that the only way to get rid of gender inequality was to get rid of class inequality. So, he called on women to join with working class men in staging a revolution to overthrow capitalism. Marx's main focus was always on class, so he didn't write a great deal about gender. However, he did leave some notes on gender, which after his death, his closest friend and collaborator, Friedrich Engels, worked up into a book entitled The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, published in 1884. A catchier title might have been The Origin of Gender Inequality, because Engels' basic argument is that gender inequality was caused by the simultaneous rise of those three social institutions: the formalized family, private property, and the state. Engels argues that when these institutions arose, men swiftly took control of all three and then used them to push women into a secondary place in society. Engels argued that originally in tribal society there was gender equality. Men's and women's contributions to the tribe were equally valued. There were no formal social institutions, and that included no formal marriage. Monogamy had not yet been invented. Instead, there was what Engels called communal marriage, where you married into the tribe as a whole, and all the men of a given generation were potential sexual partners for all the women of that generation. Nobody cared who the biological father of a given child was, because the tribe as a whole was your family. And in the tribe, everybody looked after everybody else. Engels argued that this loose and informal type of family structure promoted gender equality. However, said Engels, everything changed with the rise of agriculture. Marx categorized societies in terms of their mode of production, the type of economy they had. Engels argued that every mode of production has to have a corresponding mode of reproduction, which consists of a particular family structure and a particular set of gender relations. Marx said that we have to produce to survive. Engels said that we also have to reproduce to survive. For Marx and Engels together, production and reproduction are the two most important aspects of society, and they always have to fit together. So, if society's mode of production changes, its mode of reproduction changes too. This meant that the transition from hunting and gathering society to agricultural society had a huge impact on the family and gender relations, as well as on economics and politics. Agriculture, first of all, provided more food, which led to a population explosion. Small tribes grew into large nations. But this meant that the old, informal way of assigning social positions based on everybody knowing everybody else no longer worked, because now everybody did not know everybody else. Social institutions had to become more formalized. Politics became formalized around the state, and the economy became formally organized around private property. The problem was, said Engels, that both of these quickly became controlled by men. The main reason for this was that men made up the military. Most early states were established by armies, and most early property consisted of booty plundered by armies. So, men came to control the state and own the property. Men became rich and powerful. Over a period of thousands of years, women were gradually excluded from these institutions and lost their political and economic rights. Engels called this process the world historic defeat of the female sex. This was the time when gender inequality entered society. Eventually, women became, by law, the private property of their fathers while young and of their husbands once they married. This means that, whether the term was used or not, women had been reduced to the legal status of slaves. If you're someone else's property, then you're a slave. As the whole world gradually made the transition from tribal society to agricultural society, women made the transition from equality to domestic slavery. This decline in women's social status was also reinforced by the creation of a more formalized family structure. Engels argued that private property and the state were both built around the family through the institution of inheritance. Inheritance through the family became the central means of transmitting both property and political office from one generation of men to the next. Women became a means to an end, the reproduction of a male heir, a son. But this meant that now it mattered who a child's father was, because each man wanted his son to inherit his money or political position. With inheritance, you can have competing claims and social conflict unless you can establish a clear line of paternity. So, marriage became a formal, legally binding contract, the marriage contract. And in the Western world, it became monogamous. Monogamy, said Engels, had nothing to do with love or faithfulness. It was about giving the man a monopoly on the reproductive powers of his wife, so that he could ensure that any children she had were his children. Women were told that the morally right thing to do was to remain virgins until they married and to remain faithful to their husbands once they married. That way, there could be no confusion over the paternity of their children. In addition, marriage contracts were drawn up, which made fidelity a legal requirement. Since these contracts were just another form of business contract, they in effect turned marriage into a business arrangement. For Engels, virginity and fidelity are not about love or virtue. They're about private property and maintaining lines of male inheritance. Engels went on to argue that even though all of this happened thousands of years ago, and even though since then we've made the transition from agricultural to industrial society, nothing has really changed for women. In Engels' day, the 19th century, women were still the private property of their men. In the upper class, women were excluded from property rights, business ownership, or inheritance unless there was no male heir. In the middle class, women were excluded from higher education. And in the working class, women had mostly been pushed out of the paid workforce and turned into housewives. A new gender division of labor emerged in industrial society. Men engaged in wage labor, done in the workplace, while women engaged in domestic labor, done in the home. Both types of work are equally necessary for the survival of the family. But only wage labor is considered real work because only wage labor is rewarded by society by getting paid. Domestic labor is unpaid labor or slave labor. This all meant that, whatever their class background, most women had no means of earning an income, which meant that they were all dependent on men to support them. And of course, said Engels, whoever controls the family's livelihood controls the family. Marxist feminists built on Engels' position that gender relations must be understood in terms of women's roles in production and reproduction, or wage labor and domestic labor. In capitalist society, women were originally given the primary responsibility for reproduction, and more recently they've also been given a steadily growing role in production. However, men still do the majority of wage labor, while women do the majority of domestic labor. Feminists like Canadian Meg Luxton examined the huge quantity of domestic labor performed by supposedly unemployed housewives. She argued that the distinction between wage labour and domestic labour should be broken down. They're both work. They're both essential to survival. And they even both contribute to the economy. Women's work in reproduction is essential to production because, in economic terms, women reproduce the workforce. As wives, women are responsible for seeing to it that their husbands are fed and cared for and kept healthy so that they can keep going to work. And as mothers, women are responsible for bearing and raising their children who are going to be the next generation of workers. Without reproduction, there is no production, because without women's work, there are no men or women to work. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, women were mostly excluded from production, but given virtually complete responsibility for reproduction. Housework was women's work. But through the latter half of the 20th century, more and more women entered the paid workforce. At first, they continued to have full responsibility for domestic labour, so women found themselves stuck doing what was called a double day of labour or a double shift. That is to say, putting in one day of work at the office and then another day of work at home. The sheer physical impossibility of maintaining this workload has meant that men have had to, very gradually and very reluctantly, take on more responsibility for domestic labour. However, a recent study found that in Canada, women still do close to 70% of the housework. On the other hand, while women put in more hours of domestic labour, men put in more hours of wage labour, so that the total workload has roughly evened out. In poorer countries, however, women still do significantly more total work than men. Canadian Marxist feminist Patricia Connolly argued that women's traditional role in capitalism has been that of a reserve army of labour. Women have been mobilized into the workforce when needed, then sent back to their homes when they're no longer needed. This could be seen particularly during the two world wars. Both times, so many men joined the army that there was a labour shortage, and women had to be used to help build all those guns and bombs and airplanes. Rosie the Riveter was the famous advertising campaign used to get women into factories in World War II. But both times when the war ended, the slogan became, "Jobs for the boys." The returning heroes had to have jobs, so women were told to go back to their kitchens. More generally, said Connolly, women have been last hired, first fired. In other words, women get the jobs with the lowest job security, as well as the lowest pay. In Canada, at the start of the 20th century, women's wages were on average only about half of men's wages. Since then, all women have made progress, but some have made more progress than others. When some women gained access to higher education and thereby to the professions after World War II, they attained the bargaining power to successfully fight for gender equality in wages. Moreover, in a competitive capitalist economy, corporations need talented, educated professionals, and they can't afford to lose them just because they're women. By the 60s, sexism was just wasting educated women's talent and ideas, which ultimately cost the corporations more than it saved them. So, today, women, doctors, lawyers, professors, and scientists make essentially the same wages as their male counterparts. If you've got the education and the qualifications, then nobody cares anymore if you're a man or a woman. However, middle-class women are only a minority of working women. Most working women are working class, and working class women's wages are still only about 3/4 of men's wages. This is why women continue to fight for equal pay for equal work. However, the fight for equal pay is perhaps not as difficult as the fight for equal work in the first place. Women have been denied equal work with men in two main ways. Firstly, most businesses and government bureaus are run by men, and men tend to promote men before women. This means that most bureaucratic organizations have put what's been called a glass ceiling on women's careers. Women get promoted so high and no higher. It's called a glass ceiling because it's officially invisible. It'd be against the law to have an official policy against women's promotion, so there's nothing written down. It's just that men make sure that men continue to run things, and most of the top jobs remain an old boys' club. Women tend to be concentrated at the bottom end of any occupation. For example, in healthcare, most nurses are women, but a majority of doctors and an even bigger majority of hospital administrators are men. Similarly, in education, most primary school teachers are women, but a majority of high school principals and university professors are men. In the workforce, moreover, women are still being denied equal work with men because there also exists what's termed a dual labor market, which means that employers mostly hire men for certain jobs and women for other jobs. Our economy still maintains a clear gender division of labor. There are men's jobs and there are women's jobs. The problem with this is that women's jobs are much more restricted than men's jobs. Indeed, in Canada today, about 3/4 of all employed women work in just 5 areas, all of which are extensions of women's work in domestic labor. Those 5 areas are teaching, nursing, sales, service, and clerical or secretarial work. Teaching is an extension of mothers' role in socializing their children. As I just said, most women teachers are in primary schools teaching young children. Nursing is an extension of women's role as caregiver. When the child skins his or her knee and comes home crying, it's mommy that puts on a band-aid and kisses it and makes it better. Nurses do the same thing, minus the kissing, in the hospital. Sales and service are both extensions of women's role as a domestic servant. The waitress who brings you your meal in the restaurant is doing the same thing as mom bringing supper to the kitchen table. Secretarial work at first sight may not seem like housework, but studies have shown that in the modern family, women usually play the role of what's been called domestic manager. In other words, women mostly do the family paperwork. They handle the correspondence, they pay the bills, they balance the family budget, they file the records, and so on. Secretaries do the same thing in the office. Moreover, the office recreates patriarchal family relations in the workplace. You have a usually male administrator with a usually female secretary. The man makes the decisions, gives the orders, and gets paid the big bucks, while the woman has to do the boring, menial work. Secretarial work, like most working class women's work, tends to be low pay, low status, low initiative, and with low prospects for promotion. Secretaries have virtually been treated like office furniture. When the man gets his office, it comes with a desk, a phone, and a secretary. So in short, although professional women have virtually gained equality with men, for most working class women, gender discrimination is still an everyday reality. However, despite these ongoing inequalities, women's social and economic position has obviously improved significantly since Engels' day. In the course of the 20th century, women gained property rights and the right to vote, obtained higher education and entered the middle class, and even to some extent entered the capitalist class, although most big businesses are still run by men. Engels, I'm pretty sure, would have been very surprised by all the progress that women have made, because he, like Marx, didn't think that women could improve their situation significantly without a revolution. In this, he was clearly mistaken. Women have made enormous progress without participating in the violent revolution that Marx and Engels called for. Women are generally less violent than men, so bloody revolution has never held much appeal for most feminists. The women's movement has always favoured peaceful, gradual reform over violent, abrupt revolution. Marx and Engels believed that gender inequality and class inequality were interconnected. Engels argued that private property, the state, and the family were connected by the central institution of inheritance. Both private property and political office were originally based on inheritance within a privatized family structure. However, while this was still largely true in Engels' day, it is no longer the case. In the 20th century, political positions were attained through democratic elections rather than inherited titles. And family businesses were replaced by corporations as the central economic structures of capitalism. While family businesses still, of course, exist, their social position is minor compared to the wealth and power of corporations. Most corporations grew out of family businesses, and many are still built around family ties. However, the central organizing principle of corporations, like modern states, is not family, but bureaucracy. Corporations survive by selling shares on the stock market, not through family inheritance. And as private property has evolved beyond inheritance, women have largely been freed from their responsibility to provide a son and heir. As the mode of production has changed, the mode of reproduction has changed. The connection that Engels saw between private property and the family has been largely severed. Early capitalism created economic structures and circumstances which put women at a disadvantage. But that is changing in today's capitalism. You can't have capitalism without class inequality, but you can have capitalism without gender inequality. Gender inequality is not built into capitalism the way class inequality is. Rather, capitalists have used a pre-existing sexism as a pretext to pay women less and so raise their profits. But they don't have to do that. Capitalism will survive if gender inequality is eliminated. The women's movement is fighting to do this, but not through violent overnight revolution, but rather through peaceful, gradual reform. Next, we shall look at culture, which has been examined by both Marxist feminism and liberal feminism. Marxist feminists, like Michelle Barrett, argue that while sexism and gender inequality are not built into capitalism or necessary for its functioning, still, they have been promoted and used by capital to serve its own interests. The most obvious of these is that sexism has been used as a pretext to pay women lower wages and so increase the capitalists' profits. But Barrett also identifies a more subtle, but perhaps more important ideological effect of sexism in capitalist culture. When industrial capitalism first arose in 18th and 19th century Europe, the capitalists had to push aside the old ruling class, the aristocracy, in order to become the new ruling class. Now, mostly they did this by becoming richer and more powerful than the aristocracy. But they also had to win the ideological battle. They had to justify their rule. They had to persuade the common people that they deserved to rule more than the aristocracy. To do this, they launched an ideological offensive. On the one hand, the aristocracy were portrayed in negative terms. They were old, obsolete, corrupt, useless parasites who were only interested in partying, drinking, and having sexual adventures, even, shock horror, homosexual adventures. They had no moral standards, and they were a disgrace. On the other hand, the capitalists, or bourgeoisie, were portrayed in positive terms. They were sober, responsible, and hard-working businessmen with high moral standards. A new emphasis on respectability came to define the Victorian era. The bourgeoisie were more respectable than the aristocracy, and so were more deserving of society's respect. Barrett argues that this respectability was largely defined in terms of what she calls a heterosexual familial ideology, which included very restrictive gender roles for women. Respectable women did not work. They became housewives and mothers. The public life of business and politics was man's world. The private life of home and family was women's world. women spent most of their lives at home, and when they did go out in public, they were in effect on display at all times. They must always look their best and always act with decorum. As a rule, they had no money of their own and had to ask their husbands for everything. The man earned the family income, and his wife had to spend it in such a way as to cover the family's needs. Capitalism redefines everyone as consumers, but the housewife is the ultimate consumer. The problem with being a consumer is that it's a passive role. You just buy what the ads tell you to buy. More broadly, this privatization of women's lives also meant isolation. Women were cut off from their traditional kinship networks and left dependent on men and vulnerable to male violence. Anne McClintock has called this role, quote, an ideal of white domestic femininity. And for most women, for most of the 18th and 19th centuries, it was just that, an ideal. An ideal designed by and for the wealthy. An ideal of bourgeois femininity. This is because only the men of the middle and upper classes earned enough for their wives not to work. Working class women continued to work, as many still do, because their families could not survive financially without their contribution. Stay-at-home housewives were a status symbol for the bourgeoisie. And having a proper, respectable, stay-at-home housewife demonstrated that the bourgeoisie was not only more moral than the aristocracy, it was also more moral than the working class. The bourgeoisie set itself up as the most moral segment of society, and so the most deserving to rule. This ideology has become so pervasive in Western society that many people still believe that the stay-at-home housewife has been woman's role from time immemorial, when in reality it arose in the 19th century and declined in the 20th century. Only for a few brief decades in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were a majority of Western women stay-at-home housewives. As part of the overall restriction of women's role in society, women's sexuality was also restricted. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, for a woman to be respectable meant being practically sexless. Sex was for procreation, not pleasure. Respectable women did not enjoy sex, they just accepted it as a necessary evil in order to have children. The classic advice given to women in Victorian Britain was, lie back and think of England. Since homosexuality could only be for pleasure, not for procreation, it was condemned as immoral. Lesbianism, which could lead to women forming their own relationships and living their own lives outside of male control, was condemned as immoral. Prostitution, which could provide women with an independent source of income, was condemned as immoral. Women's sexuality was redefined in capitalist terms as being about motherhood and the procreation of children, especially the son and heir that every capitalist wanted. This Marxist feminist analysis provides the economic background to the liberal feminist critique of Western culture, provided by Betty Friedan in her groundbreaking book, The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963. Here she argued that Western culture had created a mystique around femininity. In other words, it had created a particular image of what women were supposed to be in modern Western society. And what women were supposed to be was wives and mothers, and that's all. Motherhood was glorified. Mothers were practically saints, and mother love was the greatest love of all. Women were told that they all had an innate need to be mothers, and that they all had boundless reserves of mother love, which in practice consisted of working and sacrificing endlessly for their husbands and children. American Jessie Bernard built on Friedan's work, arguing that young girls were put through a process of what she termed coercive socialization, which brainwashes them to accept being coerced to play the role of mother. Women were assigned a particular social role, and it was a very restricted social role. Up to the 60s, motherhood was virtually the only role that was considered socially respectable for women to play. Girls were taught that the most important thing for a woman was to be respectable and maintain her good reputation, and respectable women did not work. So, girls were not taught workforce skills. They were taught domestic skills, nurturing skills, and social skills. And of course, they were taught to pay great attention to their outward appearance. Now, times have, of course, changed. These days, most women are expected to get an education and to work. But on the other hand, the pressure on women to look good for men is perhaps greater today than ever before, with women being pushed to use makeup, diets, even plastic surgery. This means that the process of coercive socialization of girls to make them into what men want them to be has changed since Bernard wrote about it, but it has not disappeared. Women's social roles changed in the 50s and 60s because of two technological and economic developments. Firstly, computerization and bureaucratization opened up new jobs for women as office work replaced factory work. This undermined the mystique of the stay-at-home mom. Capitalism now needed women in the workforce. Demand from working women quickly led to the second development, the invention of effective birth control, particularly the birth control pill, which became available in 1960. These two developments led to the so-called sexual revolution of the 60s. In practice, this revolution consisted of a rejection of the Victorian bourgeois morality, which had dominated the West for about the previous 2 centuries. Almost overnight, sex stopped being primarily about procreation and became primarily about pleasure. Inevitably, this primarily meant a redefinition of women's sexuality, from motherhood to sex symbol. In the 60s, women went from sexless to sexy. Birth control allowed women to have fewer children, which gave them more time for education and a job, but it also gave them more time to get sexy for men. And men have come to expect and even demand that. American Naomi Wolf has argued that modern Western culture socializes girls to believe in the beauty myth, which is that nobody will ever love or even like them unless they're beautiful. the media create beauty norms, which women try to live up to. The problem with that is they can't. The modern media turn pictures of women into computer-enhanced images of perfection. In fashion magazines, every square inch of every picture is literally gone over with a magnifying glass. And any warts, zits, scars, or even stray hairs are removed. And then they really go to work. Legs are stretched out, breasts are pumped up, hair is given that special shine. In short, an inhuman standard of beauty is created, a standard that no real woman can live up to. Nobody can really look as good as the pictures in the fashion magazines. So when girls try to live up to that standard and fail, it can lead to problems. Since the 60s, we've seen the emergence of eating disorders such as bulimia, where you binge eat, then purge, and anorexia nervosa, where you virtually just stop eating. These come from all the social pressure on girls to diet and constantly being told that girls can never be thin enough. This can also lead to depression, which in extreme cases can even lead to suicide. In short, women's role in society has changed over time, and how women and men are socialized has also changed, but women are still being coercively socialized to live up to men's expectations. And this is still harming women, both physically and psychologically. When capitalism created this image of femininity, it also had to create a corresponding image of masculinity. This has been studied by Robert Connell, among others. I used to use Connell as an example of how you don't have to be a woman to be a feminist, but a few years ago Robert Connell became Roberta Connell, so maybe that wasn't such a good example. Regardless, Connell argued that if women were to be socialized to be submissive, men had to be socialized to be dominant. In feudalism, men were expected to be tough, but they were also expected to be just as emotional and demonstrative as women. If your buddy got killed on the battlefield beside you, you cried. Capitalism invented the idea that only girls cry and that real men are strong, silent types. Capitalism redefined the masculine role as that of a provider and protector who is tough and hard-working, but emotionally distant and uncommunicative. The values of this new masculinity are those of power, control, ambition, and competitiveness. In short, the values of capitalism. Capitalism rewards those men who adopt its values with money, power, status, and independence. Men receive what Connell called a patriarchal dividend, meaning they get more of everything just because they're men. They even expect this because, as boys, they're socialized with an entitlement mentality, which leads them to believe that they are entitled to more just because they're male. For example, every time that mom cleans up after her boys, because boys will be boys, but insists that her girls are neat and tidy and even help her clean, she's sending the message that if men only wait long enough, some woman will come along and clean up their mess. Such lessons can instill sexist expectations and attitudes without mom or the boys even being aware that this is happening. However, said Connell, there is a price for this male dominance. Adopting this macho image of masculinity stunts men's emotional development. It cuts them off from their own feelings as well as the feelings of others. It makes it difficult for them to form meaningful relationships and can make them feel lonely even when they are in a relationships. Surveys show that men who abandon this dominant role and instead establish an equal partnership with their wives are in the long run much happier in their marriages. For liberal feminists, gender inequality stems from sexist attitudes. But nobody is born sexist. Sexism has to be learned. It's learned the same way we learn most of our basic attitudes, through socialization. And socialization has changed in the course of history. In early tribal societies, children were raised by groups of women, and they taught the children to respect women. Agricultural society first saw the introduction of sexist attitudes taught by the male-dominated organizations that emerged at that time, the army, the state, the church, and so on. However, that was more for the aristocracy, whose social position was based on the male military. Most peasant children were still raised by extended families, meaning groups of women. But modern industrial society has destroyed women's kinship networks. As the extended family has shrunk to the nuclear family, which just consists of ma, pa, and the kids, women's voice in socialization has shrunk to just that of the mother. Meanwhile, men's voice has expanded as men have created more male-dominated organizations, the media, schools, corporations, and so on. Men largely took over socialization and introduced sexist attitudes designed to justify male domination or patriarchy. Children were socialized to accept sexist gender roles and sexist norms of masculinity and femininity. Boys were socialized to play the dominant role in society. Girls were socialized to play the submissive role. Boys were socialized to prepare for careers. Girls were socialized to prepare for motherhood. In the 60s, liberal feminists began to make Western society aware of just how sexist Western culture was. All of our main institutions, especially the media, promoted attitudes that restricted and belittled women. Women were infantilized, for example, by being called things like girl, baby, chick, and so on. Women's concerns were dismissed as unimportant. Some feminists even argued that Western culture had become misogynistic or woman-hating. For example, in theory, Western culture is against violence towards women. But in practice, the media create these macho he-man stereotypes where a real man is a man who solves his problems with his fists, an attitude which is inevitably going to promote male violence towards women. Similarly, Western culture says that women are just as smart as men, but then creates negative female stereotypes like the dumb blonde and the brainless bimbo. Essentially, Western culture has created a double standard. which allows men to behave towards women pretty much as they please, but which expects women to live by male rules, male standards of behavior, male standards of morality, and, last but by no means least, male standards of physical beauty. Liberal feminists did not just draw attention to this sexist socialization, they demanded that it be eliminated. They said that gender inequality is based on sexist attitudes. So, to get rid of gender inequality, you have to get rid of those attitudes. They said that the cycle of sexist ideology and gender discrimination can be broken. But the only way to do that is to change our socialization. Changing society has to begin with changing how society thinks. Western culture had a very negative and limited image of women, so that needed to be replaced with a more positive image. And gradually it was. For example, early TV shows and movies almost always showed women as either housewives or men's assistants or sex symbols. But from the late 60s on, we see women in the media portraying more positive, responsible gender role models as doctors, lawyers, superheroes, and so on. And as society's image of women in the media changed, the message that children got about women changed. And, lo and behold, the liberal feminists were right. As socialization has changed, sexist attitudes have declined, and gender inequality has declined. Sexism is gradually becoming socially unacceptable or politically incorrect. However, it has certainly not disappeared. It has been argued that the coercive socialization of women in Western culture has not so much lessened as just changed. In the 19th century, the age of heavy industry, when male strength was needed, there were no jobs for women. So they were told they had to be housewives. And lines of inheritance had to be preserved, so they were told they had to be faithful and respectable. But then, in the 50s, office jobs appeared for women, and in the 60s, effective birth control became widely available. Suddenly, women did not have to be just housewives and mothers. They could be whatever they wanted to be, as long as they stayed sexy. On TV and in movies, women can be doctors, lawyers, politicians, whatever, as long as they still look like fashion models. Women are constantly bombarded with ads telling them to get sexier by using makeup, lingerie, sexy clothing, going on a diet, or even having plastic surgery. There has never been so much social pressure for women to live by male standards of physical beauty. Men are still establishing expectations which women have to live up to. So, coercive socialization is still with us. It's just changed because society has changed. Nevertheless, I would argue that overall Western culture has become significantly less sexist over the last 60 years or so, and this has contributed to a decline in gender inequality. Finally, we shall look at politics. All schools of feminism agree that social change cannot happen without political change. women had been pushed out of politics over the course of history, and when the first wave of the women's movement mobilized in the 19th century, it quickly became apparent to them that gaining women's political rights was essential to any future progress. The crowning achievement of the first wave was gaining women the right to vote and to stand for political office by the 1920s. When the second wave got going in the 60s, one of its first slogans was, "The personal is political." What this meant was that women had become so isolated from each other that each one thought that her problems were just her individual personal problems, when in reality they were social problems that affected millions of women, and so they had to be addressed through political action. The state had to provide legal protection from male violence and shelters for battered wives. The state had to pass laws banning gender discrimination in the workplace and sexual harassment in the workplace. The state had to provide financial assistance for poor women, especially single mothers. The state had to prevent women from losing their jobs when pregnant by implementing maternity leave, and so on. Women's organizations like NOW, the American National Organization of Women, have had perhaps their greatest successes by persuading governments to do something for women. However, in Western politics, women have hit what has been called an electoral glass ceiling. In Canada, whether it's at municipal, provincial, or federal level, women normally make up about a quarter of elected representatives and no more. In other words, women are just halfway to equality in politics. This is still the case in most of Canadian politics, but not at the very top. When Justin Trudeau was elected Prime Minister, he deliberately selected a gender-even cabinet. And when asked why, he famously replied, "Because it's 2015. So, maybe political equality for women is an idea whose time has come. Today, we do have gender equality at the very highest level of Canadian politics, except that a man is still in charge. Feminists have fought together to attain immediate changes in state policy and the law which benefit women. In my talk on the history of feminism, I covered the most important ones. However, there is considerable disagreement as to the movement's long-term political goals, especially among the big three of liberal feminism, Marxist feminism, and radical feminism. Of these, liberal feminism is the most conservative. Liberalism was the founding ideology of democratic capitalism. Its doctrine of equal rights for all is fundamental to modern society. Liberal feminists argue that liberal principles have been distorted by denying women equality. To eliminate gender inequality, it is only necessary to apply liberal principles of equality to women as well as men. Sexism distorts capitalism. True liberal capitalism would provide equal opportunities to men and women. So, liberal feminists do not seek to destroy capitalist society, but rather to improve it. Marxist feminists, however, originally agreed with Marx and Engels' position that gender inequality was connected to class inequality, and that the only way to eliminate either one was by eliminating both together in a political revolution which would overthrow capitalism. The communist society established in Russia after its revolution did make some progress towards gender equality. However, its overall image as a brutal dictatorship undermined faith in revolution as the solution to women's problems. In the 80s, socialist feminism rejected violent revolution and instead advocated peaceful reform as the road forward for the women's movement. While socialist feminists remained more left-wing than liberal feminists, in practice this brought their agendas close together. Radical feminism, as the name implies, had the most radical political agenda. In the 60s, radical feminists argued that modern society as a whole is patriarchal and that every one of its main institutions needs to be torn down and rebuilt. This included political, economic, and cultural institutions, but above all focused on the family. The family was seen as the main site of gender oppression and so the most in need of change. Some radical feminists, like Shulamith Firestone, even declared that women should separate from men altogether and establish lesbian couples with test tube babies. However, this has remained a minority view. While radical feminists established some influential feminist organizations, such as the Red Stockings, their politics have proven to be too radical for most women. Once more, reform has proven to be more attractive than revolution. Women's natural instinct is to nurture, not to destroy. And so the women's movement today fights to improve gender relations and social relations, not to overthrow them. Instead of the violent revolution that Marx and Engels wanted, the women's movement is slowly bringing about a social revolution. A revolution in gender relations and gender roles. A revolution in socialization and in attitudes. A revolution that will ultimately change every single one of our social institutions, but not for the purpose of overthrowing them, but for the purpose of improving them, so that they work for men and women. Marx and Engels wanted a revolution that would happen overnight and make everything instantly perfect. Well, that didn't work. But women are generally more patient than men. The women's movement has worked for gradual change, for reform rather than revolution. It has had many successes already, but it still faces many challenges. The struggle for gender equality continues, which is why we continue to need feminism. In conclusion, I want to reiterate that all four of the factors we've looked at are relevant to understanding gender relations and gender inequality, as are all the schools of feminism we looked at. Biology, economics, culture, and politics all contribute to the creation and maintenance of gender inequality in their own ways. In order to eliminate gender inequality, feminists therefore have to fight for their rights in all four areas. They have to fight for their biological rights, the right to live free of male violence, and the right to control their own sexuality and reproductive powers. They have to fight for their economic rights, the right to equal pay for equal work, and the right to equal work in the first place. They have to fight for their cultural rights, the right to gain an education, and the right to be respected in popular culture. And they have to fight for their political rights, the right to participate in politics, and the right to create government policies which support women. Because women have to fight on these four fronts simultaneously, And because ultimately every single major institution in modern society has to be reformed, the fight for gender equality has progressed slowly. But it has progressed. And I would argue that the progress that has already been made is proof that more progress can be made. Once you start on the road to gender equality, there's no real reason to stop until you get there. However, nobody is just going to hand women equality on a plate. If women want to continue making progress, then they're going to have to continue fighting for that progress. And feminists will be in the front ranks of that fight. I believe that we shall someday attain gender equality, and that when we do, this will be a better world for women and for men. That concludes what I have to say on issues in feminism. A written transcript of this talk is available in the video description box if you're interested. Good day.